I'm Robert Goble, and welcome to Pleasant Green. On a peaceful Sunday, December 9th of 1900, a tale told in whispers among the good folks of Pleasant Green, Utah, became a shout from a headline, a story of a ghastly crime. The Salt Lake Herald-Republican reported that a few days before, Ray Perkins of Pleasant Green, a few weeks shy of his 16th birthday, was on a walk along the beach near Black Rock. There he had found a grinning skull in a reasonably good state of preservation. Ray Mellon Perkins was born the 1st of January, 1885, in Pleasant Green. He was the son of George Washington Perkins, a pioneer who had worked with the Overland Pony Express, and of Alice Mellon, who was born in Nauvoo, Illinois, 1845, just before her parents' sorrowful exodus to the Salt Lake Valley. Ray married Lavinia Wolstenholme, a daughter of English immigrants and pioneers who had moved with her family to Pleasant Green at the age of 5 in 1889. Ray and Lavinia had raised their family in the same home Ray had grown up in, on the corner of 2820 South and 8000 West. That home today is one of the few remaining pioneer homes in historic Pleasant Green, and possibly the oldest. The writer of the story said the relic had been taken to the Herald office, which had stood at the Herald block on the northwest corner of West Temple and First South Streets, and there examined. Much attention was given to its sound teeth, for a mystery was at foot. The span of a half-century had turned many of the early pioneer stories of the Black Rock area into legend, especially the story of the Charles White family. According to popular belief, Charles and Mrs. White had settled Black Rock in 1850 with their 1-year-old daughter, where they ran cattle and boiled and sold salt. It was believed that Charles had been unhappy in the marriage and had abandoned Mrs. White and their daughter, that he had become disaffected with the Mormon way of life, had become friendly with U.S. soldiers who were generally hostile to Mormons, to return with them back east, never to be seen again. Mrs. White and her daughter were left to the dangers of frontier life, and after having their cattle stolen by rustlers, were left destitute, and worse, were savagely murdered. The writer of the Herald concluded, "There is little reason to doubt that all that is mortal of Mrs. White has been found. From the description of the place where the skull was located, from the soundness of the teeth, which many old residents remembered as a characteristic of Mrs. White, those who knew her think the lake has given up this reminder of as gory a tragedy as the records of the pioneers contain." As with any legend of the Old West, many questions are often left unanswered, many mysteries unsolved. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is celebrated for its meticulous record-keeping and the wealth of personal journals and histories that are kept by its faithful members. Mormon pioneer history stands apart in its documentation of the Old West. These records have been more than valuable in sweeping away the fog of the past, often clarifying old confusing mysteries with treasures of enlightening clues that might just solve the mystery of what had really become of Mrs. White. Charles White was born March 31, 1812 in Northbridge, Worcester, Massachusetts, to Alden Thomas White and Axa Wing. He was the second oldest of 6 children. His sister Minerva wrote of their parents, "They were not members of any church, but were worthy, God-fearing people who taught their children the principles of morality and to honor the Sabbath day." The Whites ran a brick tavern for travelers with 4 large chimneys on the house and a big fireplace in each room and sheds for horses. A sheet iron sign, painted blue, bore an eagle with outstretched wings that read, "Wing and White, Farmer's Tavern, 1828. Their father, Alden, passed away. Charles was 18, his mother suddenly widowed, and his younger sisters and younger brothers fatherless. The family continued to run the tavern with nothing more appearing in the historical record until 1840, when missionaries from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints arrived. Many meetings were held in the tavern. Minerva, 18 by then, wrote, "The words of the elders sank deep into my heart, and I was at once convinced that their doctrine was the same that Jesus and his disciples preached. Soon after this, I was baptized and received the gift of the Holy Ghost." 2 years later, Axa Wing White sold all her interests and those of her minor children to Nelson Payne, who married her eldest daughter, Annie. With some of her children, including Charles and Minerva, Axa left Massachusetts for Nauvoo, Illinois, where they would make a new home. Charles was baptized in Nauvoo in 1843 and later ordained a 70. He received his patriarchal blessing from Hiram Smith, Joseph Smith's brother, the 10th of January, 1844, 5 months before Hiram was martyred in Carthage, Illinois. Rachel Elwell was born February 24, 1809 in Cushing, Lincoln, Maine. She married Moses H. Robinson, who was the son of Captain Moses Robinson and Priscilla Hyler. According to a brief history written by a grandchild, Moses was killed by Indians. Her husband's cousin, John Robinson, had met Elder Alfred Dixon and converted to the church, and in 1843 sold his interest in his ships and land holdings and took his wife and 5 children to Nauvoo. Rachel left Maine also to Nauvoo around this time, possibly with the John Robinson family. They arrived 2 months after the martyrdom of Joseph Smith, during a time of great grief, uncertainty, and increasing mob attacks. The record again becomes unclear, except that Charles entered the Nauvoo temple on December 30th, 1845. Rachel's great-grandchild wrote, "Charles married Rachel Elwell Robinson somewhere between there and Salt Lake, probably at winter quarters, since he took out his endowment in Nauvoo before they crossed the ice that fateful winter, at which time no mention is made of a wife." The Saints' exodus from Nauvoo began February 4th, 1846. Between February and the culminating battle and surrender of Nauvoo on the 13th of September, 1846, nearly 15,000 saints had been driven from their homes, suffered freezing, sickness, destitution, privation, and death. Of those who built the temporary winter quarters, where today sits Florence, Nebraska, over 600 were buried overlooking the Missouri River. It's unknown which wagon or handcart company Charles White had traveled with. There is no record yet found of Rachel Elwell with any company. The John Robinson family had left winter quarters June 17, 1847, with the Edward Hunter, Joseph Horn Company. They arrived in the Salt Lake Valley September 29, 1847. Charles' mother, Axa Wing Snow, along with both her daughter Minerva and sister Louisa, had married Erastus Snow as plural wives, probably in Nauvoo. She left winter quarters June 6, 1848, with Brigham Young's massive 1st Division, one of the largest, 1,220. Some of the names and individuals are unknown or aren't accounted for. They arrived the 20th through the 24th of September, 1848. Records show that Charles filed for a lot in Salt Lake City in 1848. In August of 1848, Rachel conceived their first child, Clarissa Elnora White, who was born May 2, 1849 in Salt Lake City. By 1850, Charles was herding cattle at Black Rock and manufacturing up to 300 pounds of fine salt in sheet iron boilers per day. "1851 proved to be a very busy year for their family. The peace and solitude, in spite of the traffic of both pioneer and Indian past their home, was broken for several days as preparations began for a great 4th of July celebration. Pregnant and nearing the end of her last trimester, Rachel must have witnessed the hauling of the cannons, the putting up of the flagpole, and the many other works performed by volunteers sent by Brigham Young. On the morning of the 4th, at daybreak, the inhabitants of Great Salt Lake City were awakened by 3 rounds of cannon. The men at Black Rock, with their cannon, responded likewise. More cannon signals from the city at 7 and 9 a.m. reported the preparations and the start of a great procession. Over the next 4 hours, 60 mounted men with a banner, a band carriage, and a train of 150 carriages stretched over the stagecoach road that ran from North Temple to Millstone Point, past the ranches near Toronto's Cave, and onward beyond Black Rock. A great gathering took place near the White Home. A flag of 45 feet at length and 14 and a half in breadth was raised at the Liberty Pole. Snow was brought down off the mountain to cool drinks and food, horses unharnessed and lariated, herdsmen put in charge. A great picnic was spread out. Speeches were given in the salty wind. Mountain climbing and swimming and walking on the beach filled the hours until a trumpet in the band carriage announced more speeches, toasts, and music. At 10 o'clock p.m., the cannon fired for prayer, after which dancing continued till a late hour. In the morning of the 5th, breakfast was enjoyed with the singing of John Kay and Jacob Hutchinson, along with bagpipes. By 10 o'clock a.m., the cannon signaled the time for departure, and the procession returned to the city. They say the dust plume from all the carriages blew southward. Less than a month later, on a Sunday, July 27th, their son, Charles Albert Gallatin Elwell White, was born to them at Black Rock. Indian raids in the area were becoming all too common. Cattle was the whites' main livelihood. They were the line between sustenance and ruin. On an awful day of that same year, 1851, a large band of Goshoots raided the whites' herd, decimating it, taking over 100 head. They were driven at a hard pace past Grantsville, through Skull Valley, and into the western mountains beyond. Many of the cattle, being too fat to drive, died by the way. 14 men from Salt Lake City were called up under Captain William McBride to go in pursuit. The cattle had been located in Skull Valley, but the Indians were too numerous. An express was sent to Salt Lake City. General James Ferguson and Colonels George D. Grant and William H. Kimball came out with 40 additional men. Another 10 from Tooele joined them. By then, several scouting attempts were made until, early one morning, the camp was discovered. A careful approach up the canyon was made, hoping not to be discovered, and then a rush on the Indians was commanded before they could get away. 9 warriors were killed. What meat was found, the Indians had hung and dried and stored in cedar trees. In a possible attempt to boost business and recuperate losses, Charles posted a series of advertisements in the Deseret News between November of 1850 and April of 1856. In a couple, he wrote, "All persons indebted to me for herding or for salt will please meet me at the church store on Saturday the 29th of November at 1 o'clock p.m., prepared to settle the same. And all those whom I am indebted will please present their accounts on the same day. I will take calves to herd on shares. I will take them from 3 to 5 months old and divide them at the age of 3 years. And I will take heifer calves at the same age and return the heifers free of charge when their first calf is 3 months old. I will be responsible for them so as far as straying and stealing is concerned." A report in the Deseret News of January 1st, 1855 tells of a gale and snowstorm that struck that morning around 8 o'clock a.m. The mail carriage en route for Twilla had been blown over and broken, and the horses ran off. A lady was some hurt. The salt works at Black Rock had been torn up, and the boilers hoisted into the lake, and Mr. White had to chain his cabin to prevent its accompanying the boilers. My grandmother, who herself was the granddaughter of Pleasant Green pioneers, would tell me a story about a little boy who, while splashing in the lapping water of the Great Salt Lake with his older sister, had wandered out too far and slipped in over his head. By the time anyone could reach him, it was too late. His lifeless body was brought into shore, and his mother had become inconsolable. A tiny note under Charles Albert Gallatin Elwell White's name reads, "Death, 5th of October, 1856. By March of 1857, the Deseret News announced that Dan Jones, the famous Welsh missionary, would be sailing the lake in Brigham Young's timely Gull, anchored at the harbor at Black Rock, with a cargo of cedarwood, fine salt, flagging for sidewalks, yards, and cellar floors, which he offered for sale at Black Rock and at his residence in the 14th Ward. From then on, it was Jones who advertised that he had a herd ground at Black Rock and that he would be receiving and caring for stock. Nothing more appears about the father in the record except one last note between his name and Rachel's. Divorced, 1860. His mother and sister had both moved to southern Utah. More has been written about their stories in other sources. If anything more is to be believed about the sensational Herald-Republican article and its grim descriptions, is that, indeed, nothing more was heard of Charles. But Rachel and her daughter's fates were far less tragic, but tragic still the same. Clarissa's granddaughter later wrote, "Rachel, without the inner spiritual strength enjoyed by baptized saints, withdrew from the refining blade of nature, and divorcing her husband Charles in Salt Lake City, went east with her little daughter of 8 years about the time Johnson's army withdrew. This same little daughter, Clarissa White, married at the tender age of 15, Henry Van Curran, who was shortly a casualty of the Civil War. While still 16, she married William W. Kesselman, and they came west to Fort Colville in Washington Territory, where 2 children were born to them, a girl and a boy. Clarissa later divorced William and married George Butts, and they became my grandparents. She probably met him at the home of her half-sister Rachel Robinson Hughes Butts, who with her first husband William J. Hughes and their 4 sons had come west to Yamhill County, Oregon, where she later divorced Hughes and married Wallace Butts, who was my grandfather's oldest brother. It was probably while visiting one another that these unions came about. After my grandparents were married, they homesteaded in Whitman County, Washington, where her mother also staked out a claim. It was then open range with only a settler or 2 and many Indians roaming about. Grandmother often nursed the Indians when they were ill. Her mother had taught her a